Good evening. I'm Joanne Myers, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome Safwan Masri to this public affairs program. Dr. Masri is currently the Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. For more about our dynamic speaker, I hope you'll take a moment to read his bio, which you all should have received when you checked in this evening. His discussion today will center on his book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, and it will be available for you to purchase at the end of the program today. In it, he provides an analysis that is not only comprehensive, but it is instructive in that it will help us to understand why Tunisia's Arab Spring succeeded when other countries in the region failed to reach their objectives. Watching the news these days, it's too easy to dismiss the hope that democracy will ever take root in the Middle East or North Africa. But it would be wrong to bend in all faith, as there is a sense that something positive is taking place, and it is where, in a small country that lies on the coast of North Africa, where the transition to democracy has begun. That beacon of light, as many of you know, is Tunisia. It is the country that sparked the Arab Spring. Nearly 7 years ago, following the self-immolation of a young fruit vendor outside the Tunisian capital, a vast wave of protest movements rocked the Middle East. From Egypt to Libya, from Bahrain to Yemen and Syria, these uprisings overthrew long-ruling dictators and transformed the region's politics almost beyond recognition. Yet it was only in Tunisia that significant progress towards a functioning democracy has ensued. The question is why? Why did this democratic movement succeed while others failed? Are the factors that contributed to Tunisia's experience really so different from the rest of the region? What makes Tunisia an Arab anomaly? For the answer to the mysteries of the Arab Spring, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guest today, Safwan Masri. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joanne, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. The topic that we're discussing is, of course, something that democracy and the Arab world in general and what comes out of the Arab world is a cause for interest, if not concern, by many of us around the world. And in Tunisia, as Joanne mentioned, I found inspiration, I found some hope, but I also found a little bit of despair because, as you'll see, many of the ingredients that I argue have facilitated democratic transition in Tunisia are absent in the rest of the Arab world. And that is also not to say that Tunisia is, home safe. It is under stress. It is a fragile democracy. It's a nascent democracy. But I think there's a lot to be hopeful about. What I thought I would do, and I rarely do this, but I thought I'll read from one page of the book to get this conversation started. And I really look forward to the conversation part of it. Kairouan, which is a town in Tunisia, became famous for producing a legal code that was centuries ahead of its time in terms of granting women rights in matters of marriage and divorce. Rights that are still absent in almost all Arab and Muslim majority countries. Though rooted in the lessons of the Quran, the code was influenced by social custom and demand, underscoring that Sharia is a human product, far from being absolute or static. Especially in the Maghreb, customary law played a critical role in modeling accepted legal and judicial practice. Polygamy, you see, had been common in pre-Islamic societies and was, as it continues to be, conditionally permitted in Islam. A man can marry up to 4 women, provided that he can treat them equally. But marriage contracts in the city of Kairouan were an exception and included clauses whereby a husband pledged fidelity to his wife. If the husband breached these clauses, such as by taking a second wife or bedding a concubine, the wife had full right to divorce and would be supported by the Islamic judiciary. So widespread was this voluntary practice that the expression a Kairouanese wedding came to imply a monogamous marriage. 2 stories, both set in the 8th century, are in the 8th century are said to have been the genesis of the famous contracts of Qayrawan. According to one, the future second Abbasid Caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, had evaded pursuit by the Umayyads by taking refuge in Qayrawan. There he married Arwa, the daughter of a nobleman, who stipulated in their marriage contract that he could not take another wife or a concubine. In another account, the governor of Afriqiya, which was the name given to Tunisia by the Muslims, and the province of Africa had been the name that was given to them by the Romans. The governor of Afriqiya, Yazid ibn Hatim al-Muhallabi, married a noble woman from the Hijaz in the Arabian Peninsula who had settled in Qayrawan. Their marriage contract included a similar clause to Arwa's, stipulating monogamy. After many years of marriage, Yazid took a concubine and his wife took him to court demanding a divorce. The judge, well known for his righteousness, ruled in the wife's favor, and the governor was forced to choose between his wife and the concubine. This was from 8th century Tunisia. Polygamy was outlawed then, or there were stipulations against polygamy in 8th century Tunisia. Polygamy became outlawed in 1956, the same year that Tunisia was granted its independence from the colonial French powers. Today, there is no other Arab country where polygamy is outlawed. It is legal everywhere. So I wanted to start with this example, one thing that highlights in my mind sort of the anomaly and the anomalous nature of Tunisia within the Arab world. And I want to stick with history for a little bit, because I think to understand Tunisia today and to understand the Arab world today, it's very important to understand the trends that were taking place leading to the colonial period that described the entire Arab world in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then the trends in post-colonial independent Arab nations. But let's stay around the 8th century for a little bit. Qayrawan had been established by the invading Arab Muslims in the 7th century. When they arrived in Qayrawan, when they arrived in Tunisia, in Afriqiya, or the province of Africa, they found Berbers, people who were ethnically Berber, who had been ruled before by the Byzantines, and before that the Romans, and before that the Carthaginians, who had established the city of Carthage in the year 834 before Common Era, were competitors of the Romans. When the Arab Muslims arrived in Tunisia, as they did elsewhere in the Maghreb, they found that they had to adapt Islam to commonly practiced traditions at the time, African as well as Berber. In Tunisia, in particular, because of a strong Christian influence that had ruled for hundreds of years, for example, the reverence of saints became something that was allowed in the practice of Islam in a place like Tunisia, which had not been the case perhaps in other parts of the Muslim world. The brand of Islam that grew in Tunisia, I argue, in the city of Qayrawan, which became a great place of Islamic scholarship, was more progressive and more modern and adopted the Maliki madhab or school within Islam, and was very adaptive, as I said, to the local customs and traditions. Sufism became very popular in Tunisia, and there came a time when not a single village in Tunisia did not have a major Sufi temple. Qayrawan produced knowledge in the areas of medicine, the sciences, and including the Maliki madhab and Islamic scholarship. There was much interaction between Muslim scholars and Jewish scholars, much interaction with Al-Andalus across the Mediterranean. What happened then afterwards, of course, is that further east, great centers of Islamic knowledge in Baghdad, in Damascus, and elsewhere were destroyed by the Mughals. Tunisia, the Maghreb, anything west of Egypt was, of course, spared that fate. Entered the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 16th century. Tunisia becomes a province of the Ottoman Empire in 1574, but then in 1711, a local ruler, a local Ottoman bey, Hussein Bey, is granted, argues for, fights for, and is ultimately granted for Tunisia a semi-autonomous status. So the Husainids, Hussein and his descendants, rule as Ottoman rulers of Tunisia from 1711 until right after independence in 1957. Now, why is this important? Because that kind of independence or semi-independence that Tunisia had during those centuries, we will see had a major role in giving it the kind of openness that it had in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, of course, developments that were taking place in Europe, very familiar to an audience like this, the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815, in 1818, the Congress in Aix-la-Chapelle to address common problems facing Europe following the Napoleonic Wars, forced North African countries to put an end to piracy, which had been widely practiced, of course, in the Mediterranean. Developments in Europe, reunification or unification in Italy, other developments that were taking place there, opened up Europe. This was the beginning of a major chapter in Europe's modern history, which opened it up across the Mediterranean to the Barbary coast, the coast of North Africa, which included, of course, Tunisia, and trade of ideas, trade of merchandise became something that was growing quite exponentially during that first half of the 19th century. During that time in Tunisia, you also had Hussein rulers enjoying the semi-autonomous status that they had with the Ottoman Empire, who were reformers and who were deeply influenced by the openness to Europe. So you had British, French, and Italian, primarily, interests in Tunisia. As I said, most of those interests were trade-related, economically driven. You had economic migrants who were moving into Tunisia. You already had a significant Jewish population in Tunisia. And of course, there were Jewish as well as Christian traders and immigrants and so on coming into Tunisia in the 20th century. The impact of all of that was an openness in terms of ideas to Europe that would have a very significant impact, I argue, as you will see in the rest of this presentation, really made a difference when it came to the events of the past few years, and specifically the Arab Spring that started there in 2010. So, for example, Tunisia in 1846 abolishes slavery. Under the rule of Ahmed Bey, the local ruler, Tunisia abolishes slavery. This was as a result of being leaned on by the British consul at the time in Tunis, who was primarily interested in taking abolitionism from England, of course, to its provinces, and then having the kind of influence that they ended up having in a place like Tunisia, and partially also influenced by the fact that you had a lot of Europeans living there. So there's a very interesting story that led to the 3 decrees that culminated in abolitionism that took place in 1846. What was interesting to me in doing the research for this book was the correspondence between Amos Perry, the American consul in Tunis, the American consul in Tunis in 1863, who writes the then leader, Sadiq Bey, and communicates with his secretary, Hussein Basha, asking him about the benefits of abolitionism, asking for advice given Tunisia's experience with abolitionism. Why did it abolish slavery? What were the economic benefits? What might have been some of the economic and social costs associated with abolitionism? And Hussein Basha responds to him in a way that shows an incredible level of sophistication, because rather than using the arguments that had been used within Islam to bring the religious authorities behind abolitionism, he talked to him in a language that, as a Westerner, as an American, he would understand. And he focused it much on labor and labor economics and the values that would be derived from that. So one way to look at it is that Tunisians actually advised Abraham Lincoln and contributed to abolitionism that took place here in 1865. But before that, in 1857, Tunisia, under Mohammed Bey, the ruler at that time, um, implements a security covenant that gave rights to non-Tunisian residents of Tunisia. Okay, that basically guaranteed that Christian and Jewish Europeans living in Tunisia were protected by law and that they had access to the judiciary and the legal system that is outside of Sharia law, and that gave them also the right to purchase lands in Tunisia. The purchase of lands, of course, became a very contested issue under colonial times. And this was triggered by the case of a Jewish tram driver who had accidentally caused the death and then an altercation with police, was accused afterwards of having been blasphemous towards Islam. He was tried in a Sharia court and he was executed. And that led then to a series of events that led to the security covenant that granted security to everybody living in Tunisia. In 1861, because of British influence also, a constitution is adopted in Tunisia, the first in any Arab or Muslim country. That constitution was then the subject of much debate between the French and the British. It was eventually abandoned, but the fact that it had been adopted was a huge undertaking and a huge accomplishment. So what I'm trying to paint for you over here is you look at the 19th century, you look at Tunisia, you had great leaders, political leaders who were reformers, who actually predated in their reforms the Tanzimat that came out of Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire's attempts to reform the Ottoman Empire. Those Tanzimat or reforms came in two waves, and they were in many respects a reaction to unhappiness by minorities who were living in Ottoman provinces, but some of those were more successful than others. There was a lot of interaction between the Tanzimat that came out of Istanbul and the reforms that were implemented in Tunisia, but Tunisia, in many respects, predated some of those Tanzimat that came out of there. But it wasn't only the political leaders who were really very influential. Many of their ministers were incredibly influential, and many of their ministers then became intellectual. They contributed intellectually to advancements in Tunisia that we will talk about in just a second. So under the Ahmed Bey, followed by Mohammed Bey, followed by Sadiq Bey, you had people like Mustafa Khaznadar, you had Khairuddin al-Tunisi, you had Ahmed ibn Abi Diyaf, important personalities who had originally been Mamluks. The Ottoman Empire often brought in Mamluks, young boys typically, from lands that they had invaded in the Balkans and elsewhere, gave them the best training, the best education, and then many of those proved to be incredibly capable and competent and were freed. And many of them married, actually, the daughters of the Sultan and his top ministers. Ahmad ibn Abi Diyaf wrote the Security Covenant. The constitution was the work of Khairuddin al-Tunisi. Khairuddin al-Tunisi then goes on to write a very important treatise in 1871 that speaks of constitutionalism, that speaks of secularism, that speaks of the separation of mosque and state, and that speaks of what we would now look at, even though he didn't use the words exactly, as democratization and holding the ruler accountable. In the West, in many parts of the West, these kinds of developments were unheard of, and certainly in the rest of the Arab world. Just to paint a very quick picture, in Egypt, you had, of course, the economic influences of Britain and France. You had an attempt at the revolution in 1881, which was then brutally crushed. Algeria, which really did not have a being to speak of when it was invaded by 1830 and annexed by France, an occupation that continued for 132 years. many of the factors that existed in Tunisia contrasted very sharply with what one would either call an incredibly dogmatic and oppressive presence of colonial powers elsewhere in the region, or barren lands, where nothing really of significance was going on and where countries that we know of today didn't exist. By contrast, what I argue is that in Tunisia, you had a nation back in the middle of the 1860s that was waiting to become a state. Now, how come it was able to get there to that point? I think it's history, the multiple civilizations that had come in, from the Phoenicians to the Romans to the Byzantines and then to the Muslim Arabs, the way that Islam developed within the country, the fact that its borders had not shifted for centuries, okay, for millennia even. Since Roman times, Tunisia's borders had not really changed very much. The only other Arab country that one can say that about is Egypt, with the exception that in the 19th century, it for a while included Sudan and its borders stretched south, and for other periods, it did not. Most other Arab countries are really a product of the end of the First World War and are a new phenomenon. So you had all of these reforms going on, but you also had reforms in the area of education. In Tunis, just like in Qayrawan you had a very important mosque that was established in 670. In 698, the Zaytuna Mosque was established in Tunis, 200 years before Al-Azhar Mosque. Okay, all of you are familiar with Al-Azhar Mosque, of course, which is considered to be the great place of Islamic scholarship that dictates how Islam is practiced and how it evolves. And largely because of Al-Azhar's influence, it hasn't really evolved that much during that period. Zaytuna, as is typical in Islamic history, a mosque had become a place of great scholarship. It became a school. It became where all the Jewish and Muslim scientists and scholars of Qayrawan collaborated around the Aqba bin Nafi' Mosque of Qayrawan. Zaytuna Mosque had taken over in terms of its importance in Tunisian life. And what's interesting is that in the 19th century, other reforms that started taking place, for example, in the field of education, came out of Zaytuna Mosque. But before that started happening, very late in the 19th century, a parallel track to education was developed by the likes of Khairuddin at-Tunisi, who established in 1875 the first secular learning institution in the entire Arab world. Okay, perhaps with the slight exception of Al-Madrasa al-Wataniya, which Bustani had established around the same time in Mount Lebanon. So here you have where for the entire region, the only semblance of education that was provided was through Kutab schools, Quranic schools, or madrasas. The elites, the very elites, studied abroad, went to Europe, studied in France, studied in Italy. But for the masses, and really for only a small segment of the masses, you had the privilege of learning how to write and read and learn the Quran through madrasas. Khairuddin at-Tunisi in 1875, frustrated at his inability to reform Zaytuna Mosque's teaching faculty quickly enough, established Sadiqi College as a secular institution that would draw on Tunisians from throughout the country and provide all of them, regardless of social or economic status, full tuition, room, and board. Right after independence, the majority of ministers who played a role in the country's first government were graduates of Sadiqi College. Sadiqi College is still up and running in Tunis. I cannot emphasize enough, the importance of that institution later on in the development of education and secularism in Tunisia. 1881, Tunisia becomes a protectorate of France, similar to how Britain became the colonial power in 1882 in Egypt, drawn Tunisia into debt, and Tunisia then becomes a protectorate, but it was a peaceful sort of process. That reform movement that was working on secularizing education, bringing reform to Zaytuna, brought in constitutionalism, brought in the security covenant, gave birth to the young Tunisians, les jeunes Tunisiens, who were the precursors, basically, to the nationalist movement for independence of Tunisia. And out of that tradition were great Muslim scholars who worked at Zaytuna, who worked on reform within Zaytuna. So for a period of 20, 30 years, you had lots of tensions that resulted in great reforms that came out of Zaytuna Mosque, including many treaties that argued for and pushed for the emancipation of women. The most consequential of those was one published in 1930 by Tahar Haddad, a Muslim scholar from Zaytuna, called Imra'atuna fi Sharia wal Mujtama, Our Women in Sharia and Society, in which he advocated from within Islam, he argued from within Islam for the emancipation of women, for the end of polygamy, for greater rights for women in issues of marriage and divorce. He even argued for abortion under certain circumstances. So you had, and again, for brevity of time, I'm just highlighting a few important incidents or examples, but this was a period between 1881 and independence in 1956 that was ripe with reforms, with openness, with getting the best out of the openness to French ideas, the French colonial power. So unlike understandably elsewhere, in the case of Tunisia, those leaders, the intellectual leaders, the reformers, many of whom became the nationalist leaders, Abdelaziz Taalbi is one good example of that, wanted to adopt the best of what the French had to offer, particularly when it came to social values and when it came to education. So you look at Habib Bourguiba, who then becomes the first president of Tunisia and rules from 1956 until 1987. He is very much a product of the indigenous reform movement, having studied also at Sadiqi College, established in 1875, but also a product of the French colonial powers, having studied and earned his law degree at the Sorbonne. Okay, and he was not alone in this. Many of his contemporaries and people who came before him and after him did the same thing. During that period also, you have the birth of the labor union movement. In the 1920s, Muhammad al-Hami and Tahar Haddad, the same guy who argued for the emancipation of women, established the first confederation for labor rights. The funny thing is that the first labor union that was established in Tunisia was established by the Italians and the French to protect their rights as laborers. Modeled after that, the Tunisians established their first confederation. But the most significant labor union movement was established in 1946, Union Générale Tunisienne de Travail, UGTT, which is, I can argue, the most important, at least one of the very most important institutions in Tunisia today, and one of the most critical factors that have ensured the success of the Arab Spring. It is founded by Farhat Hashid, and to give you a sense of what it was like, at a conference, standing right next to him is Fadl bin Ashur, the most important, the best respected religious authority in Tunisia at the time of the Zaytuna Mosque. So Zaytuna Mosque becomes a partner in the establishment of the labor union movement. And this was also a very smart move to ensure that the labor union movement was not associated with Marxism and communism, that it is Islamic to have the labor union movement in place. Farhat Hashid becomes inseparable from the nationalist leader Habib Bourguiba in terms of their significance to the independence that was coming. They traveled together to the United Nations. They come together to New York to make the case for Tunisia's independence. Farhat Hashid is then assassinated by Les Mains Rouges, a terrorist group affiliated with the French government at the time, in 1952. His assassination becomes a watershed moment in the independence movement. And in many ways, it sealed the importance to Tunisian society of UGTT and the value of UGTT in the nationalist struggle for independence. At the same time, Salah bin Yusuf, a former friend of Habib Bourguiba, who had worked alongside him in the nationalist movement, there's a big rift between him and Habib Bourguiba. Because at that time, Habib Bourguiba, who was a nationalist leader par excellence, but also became a very popular leader because of his time in exile and time in and out of French prisons. But throughout all of that, he maintained a strong relationship with the French, that during the Second World War, he insisted on alignment with the French, including, of course, during the German invasion of Tunisia. The older, more conservative members of the nationalist movement, the precursor to his party, Neo-Destour, the original Destour, side with the Germans. Even though, there are great stories about some wonderful Tunisians who played the role in protecting the lives of Tunisian Jews during the brief German occupation of Tunisia. Salah bin Yusuf emerges out of the Second World War aligned with Arab and Muslim thinking, frequent trips to Egypt before and after Egypt's Free Officers' coup of 1952. The two of them battle it out in the field, not violently necessarily, but battle it out ideologically. The end result, of course, is Habib Bourguiba wins the day, and Salah bin Yusuf ultimately is assassinated in Frankfurt in 1961. But that was sort of, the symbolic of, I don't want to paint it as if, Tunisia had always been moving in one direction. There have always been tensions, of course. There are tensions between the coast, between the interior of the country, tensions between the Yusufists who wanted a stronger Muslim-Arab identity and those who saw themselves more aligned and identifying more with the West and the Mediterranean. So all of this is to say that over a period of more than 100 years, on the foundation of an incredibly strong geographic and ethnic national identity, there have developed reforms in the spheres of religion, education, women's rights, and civil society that once Tunisia became independent in 1956, set it, I think, because also of the vision of Habib Bourguiba on the right track. When I ventured into this project, I had given a lot of credit, as most people have, to Habib Bourguiba. Turns out Habib Bourguiba deserves a lot of credit for the visionary that he was, but he really rode on the shoulders of great Muslim men who came before him and facilitated the way for him. So remember 1930, Tahir Haddad and his treatise, Our Women in Sharia and Society. One of Habib Bourguiba's first acts in power is he takes that treatise and codifies it into law. So in 1956, the Code Statut Personnel, the Family Status Code, gives women as much equality as could have been expected at that time, in that it puts into law the abolishment of polygamy and gives her far more advanced rights. Family planning is part of that reform movement. In 1961, Tunisian women have access to birth control. In 1965, they have access to abortion under certain circumstances. In 1973, the same year as Roe versus Wade, abortion becomes totally legal in Tunisia. So another factor is that over the past few decades since independence, where you had a quadrupling of Arab populations elsewhere, and where the vast majority of Arabs today are under the age of 30, more than 70% are under the age of 30, you had much more moderate growth in terms of populations of Tunisia. But of course, with the emancipation of women, half of the country's energy was released into politics, the economy, culture, and so on. 1958, he puts into effect an education reform movement that, unlike elsewhere in the Arab world, where there was a rejection of everything colonial, the Arabization of curricula, which meant that you didn't have local teachers to deliver the classes. In Tunisia, you had the reform movement that insisted from the beginning on bilingualism, insisted on the presence and the detention of French teachers while Tunisian teachers were taught, insists on universal education in the long run. So we don't jump right into it, we do it gradually, and limits the scope of religion in education systems. So unlike in other places where religion becomes the predominant feature in curricula, one, because Arabization opens the door for it, because everything then becomes taught through the Quran, starting with Arabic as a language, but then everything else. Two, to prop regimes that derive legitimacy from their relationship with Islam, as in the case of Morocco, whose king claims descendants from the Prophet, or where education is politicized through religion. So Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt wants to fight the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, gives reign over the curricula to Al-Azhar, the very conservative Al-Azhar Mosque. In the 1970s, Anwar Sadat, to combat Nasserist ideologies and communist ideologies that were on the rise, gives free reign to the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on and so forth. Tunisia avoided all of this, and as opposed to Turkey and Ataturk, who abolished religion from the education systems altogether, Bourguiba did a couple of things. One, he maintained some room for it, so up to 1 or 2 hours of religious education in the class. Two, he did not come across as an anti-religionist. On the contrary, he came across convincingly as a scholar of Islam. He held his own with Muslim scholars. He brought to his side great religious authorities when he launched the Code Statut Personnel. The one thing that he was not able to win was to provide women with the same inheritance rights as men, because women, according to Sharia, are entitled to only half a man's inheritance. But he found loopholes around it, and he granted women, descendants of a deceased, for example, much greater share of an inheritance than agnate relatives. The issue of inheritance is now back on the table because the current president, the Sepsi, has commissioned a committee to look into the issue of granting equal inheritance. So Bourguiba was very, very smart in that he negotiated from within Islam and brought Islamic scholars to his side when introducing all of these reforms. He was also oppressive. He was a dictator. He abused human rights. He stayed in his office for too long. I mean, all of these things need to be acknowledged, but he was a state builder, like very few nation state builders have been. So my argument, and I'll finish at this point, is that Tunisia has evolved over a long period of time in a manner that has prepared its people for a democratic transition, the successful examples of which we have seen since 2010. Not only did they oust Ben Ali, they had constituent assembly elections that ran successfully in October of 2011. Three parties, one of which had a plurality but not the majority, shared power. And you have a Troika coalition. In 2013, on the heels of two political assassinations, things looked like they were going to crumble. Four civil society organizations, one of them led by a woman, come together, led by UGTT, the labor union movement, and literally save the day and convince the then Islamist party in Nahda to withdraw from government, the first in an Arab Muslim country. And then, of course, 2 years later, the quartet, this assembly of four civil society organizations, get the Nobel Peace Prize. 2014, we see the adoption of a constitution that is civil and that is secular, echoes the post-independence constitution of 1959, but with a couple of twists, including a freedom of conscience article. Article 6 of the Tunisian constitution protects a person's free will and conscience, meaning What this translates into is that Tunisia becomes the only Arab country where atheism is not illegal. In 1959, the French version of the constitution guaranteed that, but the Arabic version only spoke about freedom of religion. Anyway, and political Islam and of course how Ennahda has grown is very much part of that Tunisian scenario, and perhaps this is something that we can address in the Q&A. So, but basically I conclude with trying to answer the question, can Tunisia serve as a model for the rest of the Arab world? And I argue it can be a beacon of hope, it can be a source of inspiration. There are many, many lessons that can be learned from the Tunisian example, but if we were to try today to take the Tunisian example and implement it elsewhere, that would be an impossible task. One, because some ingredients are very specific and structural to Tunisia, and other factors have been many, many generations in the making. It would take very strong political will and a very long time for them to start bearing fruit. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
I have to thank you for a wonderful historical tour, but also in this climate for highlighting the power of women in Tunisia. So,
absolutely. Crucial.
Crucial, right. So I would just ask for those who have questions to please go to the microphones on either side and introduce yourself and try to keep your question brief and to the point. So we'll start over here with female. Susan?
Susan Gittleson, a proud alumna of the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs.
Wonderful.
And this is the perfect opening for a commercial because you have enlightened us about the incredible development of Tunisia. And besides being a scholar and many other wonderful characteristics, you are also in charge of the Columbia Global Centers, which include Tunis and Amman. So how are you building on your understanding of Tunisia to enhance the program and the contacts between these enlightened North Africans and what we hope are enlightened Americans at Columbia and elsewhere?
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I'll take one at a time. That's a great question. Thank you, Susan. Let me start maybe by talking a little bit about Arab reactions to the experiment with Tunisia. Arab masses have been, I find, incredibly positive, excited about what has been happening in Tunisia. Tunisia set the stage for what was to come in Tahrir Square, in Cairo, and elsewhere in the region. What I find among Arab youth is a jealousy for Tunisia to be protected, right? And a jealousy of Tunisia because they want some of the same freedoms that that Tunisians have been bestowed upon. But they are very frustrated also because they know that many of these aims are far. Where I've tried to make a difference through the global centers and through a Tunis-Amman connection and through my own work is really working on education in Jordan. So when I went back to Jordan to establish the Global Center in Amman, I was shocked at what I had seen in society and in the education system. And you cannot, of course, separate the two because what we train our students to think and how they think, of course, carries over then to society and becomes self-enforcing. What I saw as a difference between the 1970s and late 60s when I was in school in Jordan and what I came back to in terms of the exclusionary rhetoric, in terms of the intolerance, in terms of the sympathy with jihadist type of ideologies, was just incredibly scary. And you see also the overtaking of the public space by religion. The Amman I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s was a very secular, modern Amman. And when I say Amman, I mean Cairo, I mean Beirut, I mean many of the capitals of that part of the world that had a lot of promise and potential. So what I try to do and what we are interested in is when we talk about democracy and the democratic experience, it's not only electoral democracy, right? So what's more important is democracy in terms of democracy of thought, democracy of freedoms, democracy of rights. Those are the things that we are trying to work on with local NGOs, but also with government. I mean, I delivered a very similar talk to an audience in Amman where the Minister of Education was there, and we ended up having a conversation about this with me underscoring the historic role that he plays as a progressive Minister of Education being brought in to do this. So I guess in sum, I mean, I think the most important thing to be looking at as we compare experiences and we want to draw some lessons. To me, the most important one is the area of education. I'll just finish with just one anecdote, which I actually mentioned over here. So Tunisia, part of the education reform that started in 1958 is that every Tunisian student has to complete 2 years of philosophy. You did that, right? You took 2 years of philosophy. And that was the case in 1958, that's the case today. Philosophy is not taught as part of the curriculum anywhere in the Arab world. So when I was sitting with a friend and colleague a few months before I finished the book, and he was complaining to me about the deterioration of the quality of education in Tunisia, and it has deteriorated under Ben Ali, and I speak about that in detail over here. I said, yes, but you're far better than the rest of the Arab world. And he reminds me, as Tunisians always do, our benchmark is not the Arab world. Our benchmark is Europe. When Steve Coll, the Dean of Journalism, was in Tunis during the Casbah protests of early 2011, and he asked Tunisians who were protesting, what model of democracy do you want to copy? He expected Malaysia, Indonesia, another Muslim country. The answer was not. The answer was the UK, France, the United States, and so on. But to go back to my conversation with Yusuf about education, and I said, well, give me an example of how it has deteriorated. He said, I didn't realize until I went to college that to learn Descartes the right way was not what we were taught it. And I laughed and I said, tens of millions of Arabs graduate from school not even having heard of René Descartes. And when you don't have philosophy as part of your curriculum, when Darwinism is not taught, when you don't have the opportunity to form your own opinions, you see, you got me going now, Susan. I'll stop at this. There are 3 trends that have defined the Arab mind since independence. And again, in situations like this, you oversimplify because you're trying to reduce it. You had 3 things that converged and conspired. Hyper-nationalism in countries that came out of nowhere, where regimes had to assert themselves and assert their rightful claim to the throne being, not necessarily a monarchical throne. Hyper-nationalism, religion, which also is about absolute truths, okay? And the question of Israel-Palestine, where there is no nuance, there is no gray area. So with those 3 factors, you had generations of Arabs growing up with a very strict interpretation, not even an interpretation, a very strict regurgitation of what is right and what is wrong. And, when you have students in Tunisia, many of them told me that even before the revolt, they would not only debate, they would protest within their schools. When you have UGTT, labor union movement, you had procedural democracy at work for a century. You had practice with those things that was going on. Thank you. Afwan.
Don Simmons. Apart from Gibraltar, the place where Africa comes closest to Europe is Tunisia. It's a short boat ride from the north coast to Sicily.
That's correct.
What has the Tunisian government done to dissuade great numbers of migrants, refugees, smugglers from streaming into their country in an effort to get to Europe by the shortest route?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, that's a very relevant question. It's difficult. I mean, there are more than 1 million refugees, closer to 2 million refugees in Tunisia today. The proximity, as you said, that it's into the Mediterranean. The northern tip of Tunisia is closer to Europe than the southern tip of Sicily. And you have open borders, at least historically, after the revolution, porous borders, especially with Libya. So you have a lot of sub-Saharan migrants. You have migrants from North Africa also infiltrating those borders, which has caused not only a problem in terms of dealing with those migrants who want to cross the Mediterranean into Europe, but also in terms of terrorism, unrelated to the migration or refugee issue, of course. Over the past 3 years, I think the Tunisian government has tightened up its borders to the extent that they can be tightened up, but that continues to be a struggle. Because of the openness of Tunisia to the presence of human rights organizations. The first Arab Human Rights Council was actually established in Tunisia in 1978. You have human rights organizations, international organizations operating more freely in Tunisia than they do elsewhere. After the Sisi government came into power in Egypt, for example, and many of those organizations were closed down, they all chose to move all of their operations to Tunis. So that gives Tunisians and the international community an opportunity to work on these problems, perhaps in a more conducive environment in Tunisia than they might be able to elsewhere. Thanks.
My name is Ron Randall, and I'm speaking to you as the husband of a wife born in Tunisia, who grew up in Paris, and who has taught me how important Habib Bourguiba had been in creating the open society and so forth. I don't know how to ask a question, but my concern is backsliding. After the Bourguiba era, Anne has told me that his wife and Ben Ali allowed the educational system to deteriorate, that Tunisia, which had the highest literacy and the highest education, the highest per capita GDP, has slid backwards. And I wonder how you can describe today the way the government is trying to reverse the backsliding that occurred after Habib Bourguiba.
Habib Bourguiba. No, you said it right. You said it right. So, I mean, first of all, Habib Bourguiba's education legacy lasted beyond his 31 years in power. One. Two, it didn't come out of a vacuum. I mean, that's part of my argument. Had Habib Bourguiba just been a visionary, competent leader, the effects of what he put in place could be reversed after a while. But given that it was on a hundreds-year foundation, gives it more lasting importance. One. Two, you're absolutely right. Ben Ali, under him, the education system deteriorated, and we played a role, we, the international community. The IMF and the World Bank imposed structural reforms, sought metrics that could be easily manipulated. So under Bourguiba, only 50% of graduates from middle school would be admitted into the lycée, okay, the high school, based on a matriculation exam. The other half would go to vocational schools. So vocational training was part of the cultural zeitgeist at the time. It was not something that was resisted, because when you tell a 13-year-old you couldn't get into a lycée, but you're going to a vocational school, and they were very good vocational schools, people learned those vocations. Ben Ali, for example, eliminated the matriculation exam into lycée. So, of course, everybody wanted to go on to high school. They didn't want to go to vocational school. And then if you tried to get them after high school to go to vocational school at 18, 19 years of age, they're not going to go and learn a vocation when all of their friends are now going to university. University was much more selective before then. You had the Baccalaureate Exam, which basically determined whether you get admitted into university or not. He introduced, or one of his ministers introduced, something called the 25% rule, meaning that 25% of your back grade was based on your performance on 3 exams that came during the year earlier and were much easier. Okay. And legend has it that it was the only way for him to guarantee that his daughter would actually graduate from high school and enter college. So you had a deterioration in terms of the quality standards. You had the university enrollment grew sevenfold, Reina, I think, during that period. In the Reina Davis, my research assistant, without whom I would not have been able to write this book. So in the 1990s and 2000s, the enrollment in universities went up sevenfold, okay? So as a result, what you have is a lot of young people who are graduating from college thinking that they are educated when they really are not educated, and wanting to get jobs, not being able to get jobs. At the same time, there's a mismatch now between the supply and the demand, for example, in terms of vocational schools. However, the one thing that did not change, or did not change much, is the content that is taught in education, through the educational systems. And under Ben Ali, you had one of the most influential ministers of education, Muhammad Sharfi, who was minister from the late 1980s until the middle 1990s. This is the man who was the first president of the Human Rights Council that was established, and he was a founder of Perspective, which was the student communist organization that emerged in the 1960s. So you had a former communist, human rights advocate, who became the Minister of Education, and he actually reversed some negative trends that happened during the last few years of Bourguiba's reign, when Islamists had more control over the education system and did away with a lot of Western thought. He brought it back in. And Ben Ali became so preoccupied with his kleptocracy and so on that it is a mystery to me how he was not aware how much his students in his schools learned about democratic values, learned about political participation. But that is, combined with the economic problems of Tunisia today, the single biggest threat on Tunisia's continued success. I think dealing with unemployment, which averages around 15%, the unofficial numbers are much higher. The dichotomy between the coast, which had historically, over hundreds of years, benefited more from interaction with Europe than the interior of the country. Coupled with that is the deterioration in the quality of education, again, not the content as much as it is the inflation that has come with college degrees. Now, some things have been done. So the 25% rule has been eliminated. The exam to matriculate into lycées has been reintroduced. So there are efforts to gradually bring back the quality of education that was under Bourguiba.
Can the reversal proceed without there being a great man, leader?
I think
like
so,
Bourguiba?
because you have the great history, and because Bourguiba's legacy, which is now re-celebrated. Ben Ali tried to erase it. He erased the nationalist, what's the word? The legacy of Bourguiba.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for that historical account. My name is Tarek Fatala. I'm a student, and I take your point seriously about philosophy. I graduated high school in Morocco, not until I arrived to this side of the Atlantic Ocean that I've learned about Democritus, Lucretius, Thomas Paine, and all the greats. So I take that very seriously. My question is in two parts. The first one being somewhat experimental. Knowing all the historical facts that you've shared with us today, in the early 2011, would we, by any level of accuracy, have anticipated the outcome of Tunisia being the Arab anomaly? The second one, for those of us who have interventionist predispositions, if we were to use Tunisia as a benchmark, or maybe a better term would be a base rate for success on implementing democracies in the Arab world, how to use that, and how to use that to maybe use a regression toward the mean of the rate of success.
Fantastic questions. Thank you. Tariq, you said, huh?
Yes.
Tariq. Um, so, I don't know if we could have predicted it. I don't know if we could have predicted anything. I think we totally blew it. I mean, did we predict that Trump was going to be president? My point is, to go back to that time, when you look at the role of the international community and how much we kept giving a pass card to Ben Ali, we really bought his story, his narrative. When you look at the economic performance of Tunisia in the 2000s, until the 2008 global recession, it averaged 5% growth per year, okay? It peaked at around 8% in one point in the late 1990s and 2000s, okay? It had, of course, discrepancies within the country. Many of the benefits of that GDP growth were siphoned by Ben Ali and his people. Okay, 21% of private sector profit was the beneficiaries were Ben Ali. So if the international community not only could not have predicted that there would be an Arab Spring to begin with in Tunisia, could they have predicted that Tunisia would come out as the only success story? And I don't think that we could have as observers, but more importantly, as policymakers and political leaders around the world. We failed to see any of this coming. Egypt took us by surprise in the United States. Now, in retrospect, of course, things look very different. So what drove me into this project really was the fact that Tunisia kept taking us by surprise, the fact that it had not been predicted, the fact that what happened elsewhere in the region could not have been predicted at the time, or maybe could have but was not. It drove me to try to answer this question of why Tunisia and what can we learn about Tunisia and its experience in that respect, which gets me to your second question. I think that there is great hope in youth around the Arab world, because something was unleashed in 2011. And you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, that's not going to happen. Arabs have been betrayed by the leadership, frankly, for decades. You see that now in terms of the reactions to the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. You see Arab masses in Casablanca yesterday, the protests everywhere. And you see sort of a yearning for things that is not met with an honest leadership in much of the region, not in Morocco. I mean, just more broadly. Saudi Arabia is a perfect example. You have King Salman making some statements and his son being behind other things. I think the most important thing for Arab youth to focus on is the need for reform in their societies, genuine reform. What worries me, Saudi Arabia, we have swallowed the pill in the West, and Saudi youth have. We now think that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is the greatest reformer of the Arab world because Saudi women can now drive, okay? Because movie theaters are now going to be open. Never mind the great censorship, and there are only certain movies that they will be able to see, and never mind that women and men will not be able to mingle over there. Never mind that a woman may have the right to drive, but drive where? Drive to the airport where she cannot leave the country without her male guardian's written permission, or drive to the electoral polls. What worries me, but I understand it, is the vast support among Saudi youth for Mohammed bin Salman and his reforms. But now, why do I say understandable? Understandable because they're so hungry for change. That somebody speaks in the name of change. Somebody is offering something that is different from what they had been accustomed to for decades. They're going to welcome it. What frustrates me is that there's no room for debate. There's no argument. The moment you disagree with Mohammed bin Salman, you are stigmatized as a traitor. You know, it's a betrayal. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question exactly, but I think as an interventionist or somebody who has that predisposition, I think the most important tool is reform, and the most important venue or you know, constituency to work with is the youth of the region at the grassroots level. I mean, you know, in response to Susan's question, that's what I was trying to say. And see Omar here, you know, his father, Marwan Mashar, who was deputy prime minister in Jordan, foreign minister, and is now vice president at Carnegie Council, and an author of a book not long ago called The Second Arab Awakening. He and I and others like us, you know, are frustrated by what we see. So, for example, what we did is in Jordan, we set up a grassroots group to put pressure on the government to reform the education system. And this is something that has to be done consistently, has to be done with sustainability.
Well, I must thank you for just a wonderful discussion, and I know that there are still questions, so I invite you all to continue the conversation. Safwan will be here selling his book, so thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thank you. It's great, really great.